MedTech Innovator Webinar Series 5. Today we will be discussing on health economics and working with payers. Before I introduce our moderator, here are some housekeeping notes. Do rename yourself in Zoom with your name followed by your company name. And if you have any questions along the way, do click on the Q&A button and key in your questions. Now let me kick off the webinar by starting to introduce our moderator for this webinar, Frederick Nybert, who is the Managing Director of MedTech Innovator Asia Pacific, and he will be moderating this session and asking your questions. Frederick.
Thanks, Bernice. Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those of you dialing in from the US. Very warm welcome to our 5th webinar in this series. As Bernice mentioned, today's topic is a critically important one, often overlooked. We're looking at health economics, reimbursement, and managing and working with payers. We have an outstanding panel today, and I'll have them introduce themselves in just a minute. Before we begin, let me just very briefly remind everyone, we are hosting these webinars every Thursday at this time, 10 to 11 a.m. Singapore time. We will take a break next week, but the next webinar will be on the 28th of September on public relations and brand management, so do join us for that. A few words about MedTech Innovator for those of you who may not be familiar with us. So MedTech Innovator is officially the world's largest accelerator for startups in traditional medical devices, digital health, and in vitro diagnostics. By the end of this calendar year, we will have had more than 600 companies going through our accelerator program. Those companies have gone on to raise more than $7 billion in follow-on funding. You will have, if you're in Asia Pacific, you'll have the opportunity to meet all the 24 cohort companies in this year's accelerator at the APAC MedTech Forum on the 5th and 6th of December here in Singapore. Do get in touch with us if you would like to apply for next year's program or if you'd like to be part of our ecosystem. Now, logistics-wise, Bernice already mentioned it. Queue up your questions as we go, and we'll get to those at 11 o'clock. What I'd like to do now is introduce our panelists. I'm thrilled to have Gordon Schatz here from Schatz Reimbursement Strategies, dialing in from the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. He'll introduce himself in just a moment. I believe Gordon has spent time in Asia Pacific as well. And Anne BOURCET, great to have Anne back on the panel this year as well. Some of you may know Anne. She's been based in Singapore for a number of years. Previously worked with Johnson & Johnson as well as with Abbott. Now is dialing in from Dubai. So we have Gordon dialing in very late in the evening US time and dialing in 5, 6 o'clock in the morning in Middle Eastern time. So thank you both so much for joining us. And I'll begin with the ladies. So Anne, please introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about your background in market access, health economics, and what you're doing currently.
Thank you so much, Frederick, for inviting me and to be able to have this opportunity to exchange on health economics and market access. So I have 15 years of experience in healthcare, working both at the policy side with the French FDA to look at regulatory policies, as well as from the industry, working in Johnson & Johnson and Abbott at the especially in functions that drive the patient access to innovations. So medical affairs to look at the evidence to support the claims, and medical information and adoption, as well as health economics and market access, where I spent the last 8 years of my time, in particular in Asia Pacific. I was trained in health economics early on during my studies in France. So where we have one of the most advanced healthcare system in terms of health economics, but then applied to the very diverse and complex region that is Asia Pacific. So very exciting, and a lot of learnings as well as opportunities from a market access perspective. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Anne. And Gordon, please.
Frederick and Bernice, my thanks to both of you, and especially to MedTech Innovator for including health economics and market access and reimbursement on your programs to startup companies and companies which are looking to grow into successful manufacturers and innovators in medical care. I am president of Schatz Reimbursement Strategies. My company works with startups, mid-sized, large Fortune 100 companies to develop and implement strategies that address getting coverage, getting codes, getting payment amounts so that the manufacturer, particularly through the doctors, can engage with payers to help them understand the value of the product, which frequently is in the health economics space, but also in the clinical data scenario, and make reimbursement a part of product development and make reimbursement part of the health economic and market access process. I'm very fortunate to have worked for 20 years with a law firm, and I'm a lawyer by training in the Washington, D.C. area and San Francisco, and I was stationed in Beijing and Shanghai, and worked for our Hong Kong and Singapore offices a little bit. And so I bring a background in the appreciation for regulations and law, but now I'm practicing as a consultant. The final thing I might say, which goes way back into my history, is that I actually worked for a payer, a health maintenance organization based outside of the Philadelphia area. I was an assistant administrator for a freestanding ambulatory center, and I worked in the Massachusetts Department of Health. So although the primary depth of my career is as a lawyer, I know a little bit about the way payers think, how providers engage, and what the government's interested in. And again, it's a pleasure to join you. And I congratulate those of you who are on this call because you recognize that reimbursement in health economics is important. That will help you become successful.
Thank you for those words, Gordon. Terrific. Great to have you on the panel, of course. Let's begin at a relatively high level. And I'll turn to Anne maybe first on this. This is a rapidly evolving field, as I think we all know, and perhaps more rapidly evolving in Asia Pacific, perhaps than anywhere else. What are some of the evolving trends that you are seeing in Asia Pacific at the moment? And I know that's a question that you can probably spend an hour to talk about, but if you were to summarize that maybe in a minute or two at a high level, what are some of the reimbursement and health economics trends that you see now in the region?
Absolutely, Frederick. I think that we can spend the entire morning talking about it. But I would summarize maybe in three key points in terms of evolving trends. The first one that starts with the positive, which is that we are seeing in Asia Pacific a shift of priorities. First of all, the priority that is put now on healthcare. More and more countries really realize the importance of healthcare and investing in, for example, a rollout of the universal healthcare coverage, which is a really positive trend, but also shifting priorities towards more chronic diseases management as well as prevention. So these are really good opportunities, and we see where the winds flows in terms of funding and reimbursement in Asia Pacific. However, the next two trends I would say would be more barriers and challenges, because with the shift of priorities also comes with the cost pressure. Chronic diseases is higher in terms of healthcare expenditures. We do see budget restrictions that have started before the pandemic, but has significantly increased after the pandemic, where a lot have been funneled towards combating the COVID-19 crisis. So there is such a higher pressure and need then for manufacturers to justify value for money. Very much what Gordon is saying, it has become a must-have rather than a nice to have beforehand. And the last one is also one of the consequences of the pandemic is that we also see an acceleration in terms of localization and protectionism, where many of the countries are now requiring manufacturers to have parts of their products being localized in their country to have a better access to their market.
Very helpful, and thank you for that. And then let's take the U.S. perspective, Gordon. What it obviously very established processes and policies, but what are you seeing there in terms of evolving trends on the reimbursement side in the U.S.?
Frederick, you're right on sort of the important profile of well-established reimbursement policies. I might just point to two things. Speed and data. There is an effort on the part of the medical device community to speed up reimbursement approvals. The most recent is called TCET, the Transitional Coverage for Emerging Technologies. And the problem was it took too long to get coverage. And you had to get your FDA approval, and then you had to get all this other stuff. And it delayed the flow of revenue. So a lot of people interested in this process said, let's speed it up. TCET is intended to do that. It's likely to be coming through. I don't want to promise it's not in place now, but it follows on the heels of something called NTAP, New Technology Add-on Payment, which again was intended to look at linkages between FDA, CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and speed up that process. For startup companies, that's crucial. The faster you can get flow of dollars to your customers, the better. This is not an easy process for payers. They are in no rush. So there's a little bit of a dialogue and difference of opinion on whether they want to speed things up, but certainly there are some new avenues emerging in the Medicare program, especially to try and help manufacturers get through. The second trend, I think, which is very important, this is not going to sound new to many of you, is data. And with no disrespect, many payers are data junkies, which means they want more and more and more data. There's two kinds that you need to be alert to, and Anne is an expert in one of those especially, which is health economics. The fundamental question is, when we use this product, will the payer spend more money or less money? And if they pay more, are they getting value for that additional payment? And so for you to be thinking about clinical outcomes data, cost effectiveness, cost benefit, budget, impact analyses as part of your product development will help you get into the flow, as Fred said, of trends that are emerging in the United States.
Very helpful, Gordon. And staying with you for a second, I know you do a lot of work with smaller companies in the US. How early should a startup, what do you typically advise a startup company? How early should they start to think about their reimbursement strategy?
I was on the phone with a company this morning and I said, congratulations to you. You are just thinking about your FDA regulatory pathway, and you are thinking at the same time about what are the reimbursement opportunities. So when a company is looking at how it will go through the FDA, whether they're going to collect data, that is a time to start thinking about reimbursement. There will be later times when you want to engage, but I think it makes a lot of sense for you to include reimbursement as a piece of the product development puzzle.
Makes sense. We'll come back to several of those points. So let's go a little bit deeper on the reimbursement landscape. And Anne, we have companies on the line that some are more experienced than others, but I think for the benefit of those of us who may not be so familiar with some of the diversity and heterogeneity of markets in Asia Pacific, which major markets here in APAC are reimbursed, out of pockets, copay, and for a startup company that's based here in the region, does it make sense for them to launch first in the out of pocket markets? Is that a strategy that makes sense because ultimately they could get revenue, register revenue earlier? Your thoughts on that, Anne?
Yeah, it's actually a difficult question because that's to answer this kind of question, you have the market access function in many of the big companies, pharma companies, and it requires a multi stakeholder strategy to be built on that, because Asia Pacific market is quite different from the US or Europe because of the diversity of the different healthcare systems, as you mentioned. Some are fully reimbursed, such as Australia or Japan, Taiwan, Korea. In terms of copay, it's interesting because even in fully reimbursed market, there is always a certain amount of copay, especially depending on, again, the value of the technology that is reimbursed and whether they see a high benefit where you have most of reimbursement and therefore a small copay, or less of value and therefore a bigger copay. So for example, in Korea, it could be going from 10% of copay to 40%, for example. And then out of pocket would be some markets where there is no or really low subsidy from the health insurers, and therefore the patient have to pay themselves out of pocket. And these would be typically, I would say, for example, Singapore, where there is some sort of subsidy, but it is quite small. And it is, and even for these patients, actually, they are more budget that is set aside specifically for these patients, to ensure that they would have funds to pay for health expenses, instead of an actual, let's say, reimbursement or coverage that you would see in the US. So many of the countries are in between. So one of the big example would be China. So a mixed between reimbursed, but then with a very high out of pocket, and really some pharma companies would consider these markets as really functioning as an out of pocket with some sort of reimbursement for some medical services or products. So it is quite an interesting balance between really volume versus price, obviously, because for the reimbursed market, when you get a reimbursement, technically you have access to the entire population that is covered by the health insurance. However, in many of the cases of reimbursement, then the price of the reimbursement is driven by the reimbursement price, and it is a negotiation based on the value that is perceived by the payer of your technology, and therefore the manufacturer is not free to put asking price. It is really regulated by the reimbursement price. And then lastly, in terms of the really choosing the right market to launch, I think it's really depends on what is the actual local unmet needs, the landscape in terms of funding and reimbursement, what is the competition landscape, to see how quickly you can actually get the adoption, so that you can build the right reimbursement strategy, whether you go in as a Me Too product and get the reimbursement that is existing, or do you want to go and try a new code and create your own market? So certainly for where I would see value in launching in out-of-pocket market is really if you would like to maybe test the water in terms of adoption in these types of markets. Also, it is a good way to generate some evidence and local evidence, Asian evidence, to build your case. And maybe it might be a little bit easier in terms of convincing some providers and clinicians to pilot your product, generate the case and the evidence to support the claims that you would like to have, and therefore really use that experience for other markets.
Very helpful, Anne. Very helpful. And Gordon, I'll paraphrase that same question for the U.S. Typically, do you see startup companies in the U.S. that choose a self-pay deployment of new products as a go-to-market strategy before they get coverage and reimbursement? And is it something that makes sense?
Frederick, it is something, it makes sense. It's going to be hard for me to add anything to what Anne said. Her answer was so good. It applies about 95% in the United States as well. Maybe I'll use two examples to try and illustrate how things might be a little different in the United States. And if I may, let me talk about my mother for a minute. My mother's 95 years old, and she's showing her age. She's having a difficult time getting around, and her sight is beginning to go. Let's say one of the companies on this call was thinking, we have a great product for her. It's a highly specialized motorized wheelchair so she can get off it and ambulate a little more safely. And it also has some kind of a special glasses so she can see where she's going all on a screen. Now, this could be a product that might be introduced in the United States. And let's say it's going to cost $1,000. The question is, will it pay for it? And you know what? In the United States, I would pick up the phone, I'd call my sister and my two brothers, and I'd say, look, we need to come up with each of us $250 so we can buy this for mom. Out of pocket, the opportunity is there. And I would suggest this dynamic, while it may not be true for everybody in the US, in China, where I spent a couple of years, I developed a real appreciation for the culture there. You know this better, Anne knows this better than I do, but kids are expected to support their parents, and they will come up in some parts of China paying self-pay for things that are important for their parents. This for something that's about $1,000, 4 kids, split it that way. On the other hand, if you have a left ventricular assist device, and even if my mother was having serious cardiac problems, and this is a product which costs $95,000, $100,000. That's going to be a hard, even as much as I love my mother and my sister, my brothers, we're going to have a hard time coming up with that. And there, the focus on getting reimbursement from payers is a very important thing. One final point about a $90,000 product. That is going to be sold to a hospital. The hospital, under the Medicare program, will bill not just for the left ventricular assist device. It's going to help her get up and walk around. It's going to bill for all the hospitalization of her getting that implant and follow-up and doctors. That's a big piece of money. It could be that the Medicare program is paying the hospital, let's say, this, for example, $250,000. If you look at the cost of the product, it might be a little piece of that larger reimbursement puzzle. And so part of this thinking, Frederick, that's embedded in your question, and which is a good one, is where does the pricing of the product fit into the overall economics? Anne is an expert in this kind of thing, but how you price it and where sort of the cultural environment is going to have a bearing on how you think about self-pay, starting off at self-pay, maybe continuing with self-pay, because there are some products which can be absolutely successful without reimbursement. They just have to be priced carefully for the particular market.
Very, very helpful, Gordon. Thanks for that. And let's just stay in the US for a moment. I know that many of our the companies that are on the call may not even have begun planning for their US reimbursement. So for those who are relatively new to this, just tell us very briefly some of the key differences in the US between, you have the terms coding, coverage, and payment, and how they are different, and what CPT codes are, and what some of the things are that a non-US MedTech startup needs to know and think about at a very high level, of course, and or maybe point them to resources where they can find out more. But at a high level, that would be really helpful.
Frederick, you put your finger on three core concepts in reimbursement, and let me talk about each one individually. But you also had a question in there, which is resources. On the Medicare, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services website, they have a guide for medical device innovators. It's a little old. It goes back to 2015. But for those of you who want to get oriented a little bit on that big picture, I think CMS did a pretty good job. So go on the cms.hhs.gov website, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and put in your search engine guide for medical device innovators. That might be a helpful start.
That's great. We will share that with a cohort, the URL with a cohort afterwards. Thanks, Gordon.
What you will find in that book, but what I would strongly recommend when you're thinking about reimbursement is to ask yourself three questions. Number one, do I need a code? Secondly, do I need it, and how can I get my product covered? And the third is, how much will the payer pay for the product or the procedure that surrounds that product? And Fred, if I can take about 3 minutes, one on each of those, I'll try to elaborate a little bit. What are codes? When a hospital buys your product, they're going to bill the payer for the particular patient, and they'll report the procedure, and in some cases, the product with a billing code. It goes on the claims form, and then it goes to the payer. Now these are all electronically processed, and they'll look at the codes and they'll pay an amount, typically there. So it's very important. And your hospitals are going to say, is there a code for this product? Is there a code for the procedure? And in a market access context, you want to be able to say yes. And here it is. Not having a code is an optical barrier, and it may be a sales barrier. There are three types of codes. One is for a hospital billing for an inpatient service, something called an ICD-10 PCS, International Classification of Diseases, 10th edition procedure coding system. And this is the code that the hospital bills. And they have, interestingly enough, Medicare's established a new technology component of this big system. I was just working with a client yesterday. We had a presentation to CMS with one of their key doctors to get that code. So when the hospital asks, can we bill for this? The answer is yes, and here's the code. It doesn't always generate coverage, and it doesn't guarantee payment, but it's a good start. ICD-10 PCS for hospitals. CPT codes are for the physician service, or if the procedure is done in a hospital outpatient setting. And that system, CPT, is run by the American Medical Association. They have, ready for prime time category 3 codes, and then emerging technology category 3 codes. The ready to go are category 1, excuse me. So physician, hospital, outpatient, CPT, inpatient hospital, ICD-10. The third class of codes is if your product is used in a home care setting. For example, that motorized wheelchair I was talking about for my mother with a special visualization, that probably gets a HCPCS code, also issued by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, and it is billed specifically for the product. So interestingly enough, what I'm talking about are 2 classes of procedure codes and then one specifically for a product. I think for most of you, you want to be focusing on the doctor. He wants to know, will I get paid, what code it is, and likewise the hospital. For that other class, HCPCS can be important. That's coding. Coverage, will they pay for it at all? When the Medicare program looked, if I can go back to left ventricular assist devices for a moment, they had covered left ventricular assist devices for something called bridge to transplant. While a patient with a serious cardiac failure, was waiting for a heart transplant, the left ventricular was covered just for this short period of time. But the company who was manufacturing, who by the way was ultimately bought, and you may know, by Abbott Vascular, they were developing an expanded indication called destination therapy. The question was not just would it be covered, but would it be covered for destination, for the patient to use for the rest of their lives? And this is almost a yes or no question. Is it covered or not for this particular indication? And it frequently says, well, we're only going to cover it for this class of patients if they're done in these centers of excellence, hospitals, by doctors who are really special, because we know, and we're going to limit the scope of coverage in a place where we know it's going to be successful. So not every hospital, every doctor can do it. And so coverage is, will they cover it at all and under what circumstances? At the end of the day, if there's one thing for you to focus on and drive your reimbursement exercise towards, is payment. How much will the product be paid? Or more frequently, how much will the hospital be paid when this product is used for a larger procedure? So if I may use my left ventricular assist device, the big question was, how are they going to pay for the procedure, the admission, when the patient received the left ventricle? And the company said, it's pretty much like a heart transplant. It's got the same kind of expenses. And CMS thought about it, and they looked at the kinds of health economic study that Ann and her colleagues are experts in. And they said, oh, yeah, sort of like that. And they put the implant of a left ventricular assist device for destination therapy into the Medicare payment group with heart transplant, which was pretty good. It wasn't great. Nobody was wildly happy. But that payment issue is ultimately crucial, because that will help you understand where you're going to price the product. If you get a high reimbursement for the whole package, then the pricing of your product can fit in there. And you want to be thinking about the payment when you're looking at coverage, which requires data, but it's also time when you can capture health economics data to justify this is worth it. It's going to save a life. It's going to extend a life. It's going to improve the quality of life. And that's why you should pay $150,000 to the hospital that's using an LVAD.
Very helpful, Gordon. Thank you for that. And just a quick reminder to our cohort, please queue up your questions. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or put up your hand and we'll get to those questions at the top of the hour. And looking at Asia Pacific, is the coding, are the coding systems just as complex in this part of the world? And is that something that a startup needs to think about? And in terms of the reimbursement application process in reimbursed markets here in APAC, is that typically completely independent of the regulatory approval process? Can that be done in parallel? Does it help to have regulatory approval first? How does that typically work in some of the major APAC markets? You're on mute, Anne. Sorry.
Certainly, I say that reimbursement is a complex topic, and Gordon has beautifully outlined, the key principle in terms of how you think about reimbursement. It's not just about getting a claim reimbursed. The coding, the coverage, and payment are absolutely critical. But in the Asia Pacific markets, they might not be spelled that clearly and that way as it is in the US. But you have to be aware of some of these intricacies and subtleties that exist. So, for example, in Japan, for a product, you have to ensure that there is a coding, a billing, a reimbursement, even if the payment is zero, because if for that procedure, any of the components that goes into that procedure does not have a reimbursement, so a reimbursement code, then the entire procedure becomes out of pocket. So if, for example, you want to introduce your product and that you cannot get the reimbursement, then that means that the entire procedure has to be billed completely to the patient. And there are actually some hospitals where they do see the value of proposing this kind of procedure even out of pocket. But this is a very important consideration that companies should have when they think about the reimbursement. Regarding the process of reimbursement, so it is a process that can only be applied. So a reimbursement submission can only be applied after the regulatory approval. And that is because the regulatory approval codes informs the reimbursement category that you would have. And to that question of what Gordon has said, the coverage, it determines who are eligible, which type of patients, in which situation, what would be the indication. So that's why you can only submit for reimbursement after the regulatory approval. It doesn't mean that you only start your work of reimbursement after you get your regulatory approval. It has to be started, what Gordon said, when you start to plan for your regulatory approval, it already has to start. And the good thing about Asia Pacific is that you have many of the payers who are very much willing to engage in consultation with the companies, especially innovators and startups, because themselves, they are not aware of these new innovations that are oftentimes disruptive from traditional medical devices or diagnostics or drugs, and they want to understand what is coming up in terms of innovation. Some health technology assessment, I know, actually have started what they called a early health technology assessment and scanning out what are new innovations that are going to come up, and they know that they will come in the next 2 or 3 years on their desk for them to evaluate, and they want to be prepared for that. And that's why I would really strongly urge the audience and the startups here to start engaging with the payers, share with them what your product looks like, and already get their feedback in terms of what would be the best coding, what could be the coverage, and what would be the evidence that they would need you to generate in order to get the best reimbursement for your innovation.
That's very helpful, Anna. I think engaging early with some of these payers and getting their feedback makes a lot of sense. How does that typically work in the US, Gordon? And you mentioned CMS, of course, which I understand is the single largest payer for healthcare in the US, but there are many other public and private payers. How does a startup typically engage with these organizations? Are they open to have conversations, a bit like a US FDA pre-sub meeting? And could a non-US startup engage with these payers as well?
It's a very important issue in the US. Fred, and your comparison to a pre-submission meeting with the FDA is a good place for me to start, if I may. The FDA regulates medical devices. And so you as a medical device manufacturer have absolute standing, if I can use that legal term, to engage with CMS. You are the party on the other side of that issue. It is a little different for payers. The parties who have immediate standing are the hospitals and the doctors who submit claims on behalf of their patients. You've got a little bit of a triangle: the payer, the patient, and the provider. In fact, this, I think, is built into the name of Anne's company. And don't let me steal that. She's got the whole picture. But manufacturers are a fourth party in this triangle. And there's some payers who are really not real enthusiastic about meeting with them early. There's some that are a little bit more enlightened. But with respect to the Medicare program, I think your concept is a tremendous one of a pre-submission meeting. And for certain areas like the new technology DRG add-on payment, this potentially coming TSET, the transitional coverage for emerging technologies, there are opportunities, and I would encourage the companies to reach out early. But may I make two suggestions? Think carefully about how you're going to reach out and touch a payer at what point, and whether or not you can bring one of your leading physicians with you. It's been my experience that there's nothing better than an articulate doctor who treats patients who need your product. That doctor is a party of interest. The patient is a party of interest, and he's going to be submitting claims. He's got some scientific background, and he may be generating some of the data. That adds credentials to your company in reaching out, because they always hear from manufacturers, and manufacturers always go in and say, I've got the best product in the world. It's going to change the paradigm of treatment in this kind of case. And CMS get a little tired of hearing that. But you have a doctor who comes in and says, this is a patient that I'm treating. I've had other patients with this kind of problem. These were the results. But with this product, this is what I'm getting with the patient. And it'd be nice for you to be familiar with this. And to the extent that Anne said, I wanted to pick up on a point she made, which was great. You're going to see this coming down the road. It's emerging. And we want to be here early to give you a heads up. That pre-submission meeting, Fred, could be simply an early heads-up educational meeting. You're not asking for a code. You're not asking for coverage. You're not asking for payment. You're just asking for a little bit of engagement. Sometimes it's hard to find the right person in a big organization like CMS, but that can be helpful. This is a top-level engagement. Smaller companies might also want to consider something a little bit lower down, a little under the radar, which is if you sell your product to the hospital, the doctor, have them submit the claim with whatever codes are there and see what happens. The code, could be paid. It could go right through the system. The doctor could be paid. The hospital could be paid. Everybody's happy. Or it could be denied. If it's denied, you have a doctor, a hospital, and a patient, all of whom are very concerned about that. And some of your doctors will say, this isn't right. They should have paid for it. And you ought to pick up the phone and call the doc and say, can you work with us to deal with that particular payer, if it's Medicare or Aetna or United Healthcare or Kaiser or Anthem, the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans? This is a much different kind of ask for a payer. It comes at a different time. All you're saying is you denied this claim. Can we appeal this claim? Can we ask you to reconsider? And can you pay for this patient under these circumstances for this doctor in this hospital? It's a start. It's a very low-level way of starting that educational process. You start too high at the top. You start too early. You don't have data. You don't have published articles. You don't have, if I can pick up on one of the comments in the Q&As, you don't have clinical practice guidelines that recognize your product. You may be coming in too soon. And if you ask for coverage too soon, they'll give you a coverage decision. It'll be a non-coverage decision, which is not a happy place to be. So you can start that process early. Be careful about who you're going with. Should be a doctor, at least in my experience. Or, try things out. Dip your toe in the water with one claim or two claims.
Very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for that. And just staying with the U.S. market for a minute. In your view, Gordon, how does the regulatory pathway affect the reimbursement strategy of a company? Does a payer think about whether it's a 510K pathway or a de novo pathway? Do they think that a de novo pathway is something that's ultimately going to result in higher reimbursement codes in the future? What link is there between those?
You mentioned 510K de novo. I'm going to add a third, which is the
PMA, of course,
the pre-market approval, because Frederick, this is it's another reason it's so important when you think about reimbursement when you're defining your reimbursement pathway. 510K is the quick way through the FDA, and it from a market access point of view makes a lot of sense. You want to get the product in the market, you want to sell it, you want to get revenue, and that may be a absolutely successful market access corporate strategy. Reimbursement can be very helpful. It may be crucial. It may not make a whole lot of difference. So if you want to go through a 510K and just get it in and sell it, maybe self-pay, it may be covered, that can be fine. But there is something you need to think carefully about if you go through a 510K. It's a showing and a determination by the FDA that this product, your product, is substantially equivalent to another product that's on the market. That may be fine. That product may be reimbursed. It may be covered. It may be codes for it. And for you to ride on the coattails of another device may get you a reimbursement strategy. We don't have to create your own new codes. We don't have to get a new coverage decision. We don't have to treat payment. Somebody has already done that. Medtronic's done that. Johnson & Johnson's done that. Abbott's already done that because they're great. And a 510K actually can put you into that groove. But if you're making a product and you want to get your own code, particularly in the HCPCS space for something that's used, my mother's super duper, electronic wheelchair. If you go into the CMS and ask for a new HCPCS code, they're going to ask you, how did you get this product approved through the FDA? And you're going to say, oh, we used a 510K. And they're going to say, you're asking for a new code, you got a 510K, that means you're substantially equivalent to another product. They already have a code. We're not going to give you a code. And if your market access strategy is that you're trying to beat the competition, distinguish yourself from the competition, or get a higher payment level, 510K is not going to help. De novo is a little bit better because there you're generating data and you're not putting yourself in this substantially equivalent to another product. So that starts you on a pathway to open further doors. Last point is the PMA, the pre-market approval. Heavy lift, a lot of clinical trials, frequently preceded by an ID, an investigational device exemption, which generates the data that goes into the PMA that gets you approval. Long, complicated, expensive. But be aware that there's an exception to the general rule that Ann pointed out a little earlier, that typically you can only start getting reimbursement after FDA approval. There is an exception to that rule for Medicare and by some private payers, where if you're in an investigational device exemption, the FDA can classify, this by the way is in the Innovators Guide, classify as a Category B device, which can start reimbursement during the clinical trial. Good place to be, to start that even before you get the FDA approval. Not for every device, not under any circumstances, but the IDE PMA process can open up doors of reimbursement, and it can also open up doors for engaging and starting those discussions with the payers. Maybe they don't cover, but if you can walk in with one of your clinical researchers and say, to Anthem's medical director, hey, we just got an Anthem patient. He's in this clinical trial. This is what we're trying to do. Do you cover clinical trials like Medicare does? Yeah. Sometimes you can start that dialogue earlier. So you've got three very different regulatory pathways. The final point I might make is, as many of you know, FDA can designate your product as a breakthrough device. Early, big opportunity. Not knowing all the devices from the people on this webinar, I'm cautious to make such a blanket statement, but think really carefully about whether to ask FDA, go for it. because FDA's breakthrough designation opens a lot of doors. New technology add-on payment, this TCEP goes through, it's going to be there. So if you want to expedite the process, get breakthrough. And Fred, to your point, thinking about this at the early FDA stages is of great value.
Terrific, immensely helpful, Gordon. Some great advice there. I'm conscious of time. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I did want to touch on generating evidence as well. And Anne, you spoke about health technology assessments earlier, and that's a concept that I think not necessarily every startup is familiar with, and you're starting to see more and more HTAs in Asia Pacific. What are they? What does a startup need to know? And how does a startup engage with the HTA agencies?
So HTA or health technology assessment is a very specific health economics term coming from academics, and it is a process or a tool to inform policy and decision making that is based on evidence to determine the value of a technology. And it is really helping a lot of payers and policymakers making a decision on whether they would pay for a new technology or not. In many of the markets, the developed markets such as Australia or Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they have already a dedicated HTA agency that reviews the evidence of the technology that is submitted and then provides recommendations to the health insurance will be making the decision of the payment of this technology. But not only the very developed market has HTA. Nowadays, due to the implementation now of universal healthcare coverage, many of the countries and governments are using HTA, that process, to be able to make healthcare spending decisions and the packages that are part of the universal healthcare coverage. And therefore, you do see, for example, Indonesia setting up its HTA agency, or India, which is one of the latest to announce creation of a HTA process in their countries. So obviously, they will not review all the submissions. The number would be very, very limited. In Singapore, for example, ACE, which is the HTA agency, was actually looking for submissions from providers and clinicians. And only very recently, last year, they have allowed manufacturers also to request for a HTA evaluation. So HTA is really a systematic and multidisciplinary evaluation of the properties of a health technology that really looking at all the health and the benefits, as well as the direct and indirect consequences in terms of cost. So it does not necessarily involve what Gordon said, health economics modeling, so a model of really what is the impact of a health technology on the budget or cost, but it really looks at the value it brings against the cost that it would entail, and not just the cost of the technology, but also all the services, even in terms of how much time it's taking a nurse or a doctor to use your technology in their clinical practice. And that is actually, for example, the calculation that is being done in Japan to calculate and inform the reimbursement of the technology. So it typically would involve a systematic literature review to really assess what is the current standard of care and how does your technology compare to it. And it also determines what would be the coverage. So really which patients would be eligible and for what type of indication. It could involve a lot of real world evidence to understand what is the impact of that, the use of that technology within the context, the local context of the market that you are targeting. And it could, again, go to all the sophistication of health economics and outcome research with an economic model, really depending on which market you would be targeting. So the very sophisticated requirements, I would say, would be Australia. But then in Japan or Korea, you can really look first and really focus on what is the clinical benefit your technology is bringing, and to try to aim for the most optimal reimbursement for your technology.
Thanks, Anne. That's really helpful. Another concept, of course, that I thought maybe we'll cover, and we just have a few minutes left, is of course value-based healthcare. And maybe Anne, just staying with you for a second, what are you seeing in terms of the level of interest from authorities across the region in implementing something like value-based healthcare? What is it, and how does it relate to HTAs?
Right. So I would say that HTA, as I explained, is a process or the tool to inform decision making on whether to fund a technology or not. Whereas value-based healthcare is a concept or a healthcare delivery model that is based on maximizing health outcomes against the cost of delivering these outcomes. So HTA can really be a tool within the context of value-based healthcare because they rely on the same principle of value versus the cost. So they can be combined, and you do see in some markets actually talking about both of these concepts or in consideration. So I would say some of the markets might be most interested would be Singapore or Australia, where you see a lot of policies that would rely on these principles, especially value-based healthcare, to inform how their the healthcare delivery expenditure are being used in the most optimal way with HTA, but then within this healthcare delivery model that is shifting from a volume on looking at the volume of services rendered to really towards a health outcome measurement instead of volume of performance.
Great, thanks, Anne. And Gordon, I have to ask you a related question, of course, on value-based healthcare in the US. What are the trends in that area, and really for a smaller startup venture, what do they need to know about value-based healthcare and the policies and trends that go along with that?
Frederick, I think what Anne said is applicable in many scenarios in the United States. So I will not be able to do any better in answering that question than what she said, with perhaps one or two quick points. In the US, the implementation of the concept of value-based healthcare will vary from payer to payer. For example, Kaiser is a self-contained system. The insurer owns the hospitals and the doctors are employees. And the way they measure value is very different than what a fee-for-service payer looks like, where a doctor submits a claim and they pay for that. The hospital submits a claim and they pay for that. That fee-for-service is even different than a managed care organization, like a health maintenance organization. So each one of these may approach value-based pricing, value-based coverage determinations, depending on the economics of that plan. Even in the Medicare program, they have Medicare managed care, and they give some of those managed care plans opportunities to do what I would call mini HTAs. So that is an important concept. It applies to some extent, but the basic constructs that Anne laid out, I think, are very important to follow as you think about the US, which is a highly diversified payer market.
Very, very helpful. Thanks for that, Gordon. Now, unfortunately, we could have gone on here easily for another hour or two on these topics. It's been tremendous discussion. Thank you so much for your insights and input. We are at the top of the hour, so I will ask each of you for maybe a few closing words, some final thoughts or advice you might have to the cohort companies that are on the call, or any other startups that may be in the MedTech arena, either based in APAC or anyone else. And maybe Gordon, I'll start with you.
For those of you looking to raise significant funds, MedTech Innovator is a tremendous start. But if you're looking, for millions and millions of dollars, I think you want to make sure that you've got good answers. If your investors say, do you have a reimbursement strategy in mind? What are you planning to do? And when you think about engaging with them, don't hesitate to think very seriously about how big your clinical trials and your economic studies have got to be in order to drive favorable coverage and payment decisions. The investment that your private equity venture capitalists will make in you, there will be a good return on that if they know how serious you take getting the right data. So this is not an area to skimp on. It's an area to invest time, effort, commitment, and professionalism to generate the data that they need to make good decisions. A final thing I might say is partner up with your hospitals and doctors. They have real standing. They're close to the patients. And at the end of the day, all the data and all the policies, I believe, should really focus on how do we improve care for patients clinically and to some extent economically as well. So never lose sight of your patients and keep close to your doctors and your hospitals.
Great advice, Gordon. Thank you. And Anne.
I think that absolutely what Gordon said, the patient is at the center of what you're doing. But when you think about your payer strategy, because Asia Pacific is such a diverse market, I would say really try to follow the money, as in many of the movies, because definitely there are different funding sources. Reimbursement is not the holy grail, not necessarily the holy grail in Asia Pacific. There are other funding sources that you need to identify. For example, in India, there are innovation funds that are separate from the healthcare coverage, and understanding and identifying these can really help you get your technology being covered without having to go through the hurdles of health technology assessment and reimbursement process to end up with maybe not the price that you were hoping for. So really understand well your market and the local market so that you know where the fundings are, what is the right process, but most importantly, what the value your technology is bringing within the local context. Something that is found valuable in the US might not be applicable in the Philippines because they have other priorities and not the right infrastructure to welcome that kind of innovation.
Great point. We will have to close here for our YouTube viewers. And Gordon, thank you so much for